Within 10 kilometres of my house, I pass 5 or more fast food outlets. And if you looked in the bins of houses along any suburban street, you would discover a shockingly large amount of waste. Yet, around the world and even within our own borders, millions go to bed hungry. Isaiah 58:10 says, "If you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness and your gloom shall be like the noonday." And the call to feed the hungry is repeated throughout Scripture. But how can the situation be as bad as the statistics tell us? And what can we do? Join us as we explore the challenge of hunger. Hi, I'm Jonathan Duffy, and welcome to the Compassion Challenge. Joining me in the studio is Mark Webster, the Director of Planning for ADRA Australia. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
So Mark, tell us, is it as bad as they make out?
Well, hunger is certainly still a major problem globally. And while we do produce a lot of food on this planet, there are real issues with distribution of that food, both on a global scale and on a local scale, which means that while some people may have more than they need, often there are people who miss out.
Yeah, I mean, because, it's hard for us to imagine, like, we live in this world of plenty and, you just look at what everyone throws out every day in terms of food waste. It's difficult to imagine, why is there hunger in the world?
Yeah, it is. It is hard to get your head around that if you haven't seen it or experienced it firsthand. I do think it can be helpful to break the concept down a little bit, and there are really 4 elements that can contribute to hunger or food insecurity, as we can describe it.
Okay, so what are those elements?
Well, the first one is availability. So, I mean, that really means, is there food in the area that you happen to be living? And sometimes that can be compromised. Maybe, for example, as is often the case in Africa, by conflict. When there's conflict, people aren't farming because they're disturbed by the conflict, and so there's no food. That's availability. That's your basic one.
Right. And what are the others?
Well, then you have access. So even if there is food, you really have to be able to get it. Mm-hmm. And perhaps the best example of that challenge in recent times was in the last few years, when food prices rose quite rapidly. For a lot of people who were already living on the poverty line and maybe spending 75% of their income on food in urban areas, well, the food was there, but they couldn't afford it. So that's access. Then your third one is utilization. And with utilization, it's about actually people having the food, but are they using it properly? Are they getting the nutrients? And that's particularly relevant when you're talking about young children. And it comes down to the knowledge of the mothers about good nutrition practices. It comes down to cultural factors about who gets what food. And so that's utilization. And then your fourth one is really stability. Is the food there all the time? Or are there certain times when it isn't there? And a lot of communities around the world face a hungry season, where the food is there sometimes, and other times it's going to be very tight.
Yeah, I guess sometimes we sort of think, well, why don't they just go out and work harder and grow the food? But that's not always possible, is it?
No, that's right. There can be a lot of factors that can cause problems for families with that. In Africa, quite commonly, it can be HIV/AIDS, where family members are sick, particularly the adults that are relied on for labour, and if they're sick, they really can't work in the fields. It can be, as I said earlier, conflict that's causing the problem, or it can simply be a lack of education about good feeding practices or good farming practices. Now, the good news is those are all things that can be addressed.
So, Mark, what about environmental factors? It's not possible to overcome them just by working harder.
Yeah, well, and that's certainly a big issue. Water supply is obviously a very key factor when it comes to agriculture and growing food, and that can be a problem everywhere. Now, there are technological solutions that can be brought to address access to water and irrigation, but land degradation, climate change, overuse of land. Those are also major challenges that have to be addressed. Sometimes you can do it on the small scale with a family, but often it requires governments to get involved and manage the resources of the country wisely.
I'm sometimes surprised by the fact that, we come in and we need to teach agricultural techniques to local people. I would have thought that, they would know their own local situation better.
Well, and local people really do have very good knowledge. And in some parts of the world where things have been reasonably stable, the systems that they've built up and developed are amazing. But in other places, the forces of globalization, the forces of climate change have really come in and moved people beyond where they were comfortable with as a culture and as a society. And it becomes necessary to do new things. And doing new things is risky. And risk is something that most poor people spend their lives trying to avoid, because it's not, I'm taking a risk and that might mean that I have a bit less income this year. It's I'm taking a risk and my child might die. So they're really going to avoid risk. And one of the things that we can do to help people make changes that are going to improve their access to food is to help them manage those risks.
Okay. You often hear about hunger and malnutrition. Are the two terms interchangeable or are they different?
No, they are different. Hunger is a more generic term, and in a straightforward sense, it means you don't have enough to eat. But you can have enough to eat and still be malnourished. And there is some research coming out in the last few years that would suggest that the bigger problem actually is malnutrition. For people who are living below the poverty line. Many of them can access enough food, but it doesn't necessarily have the right micronutrient balance. They're not getting enough of the most nutritious foods. And that has long-term impacts on particularly children.
So is that just about the type of foods that they grow, or is it about the nutrients in the soil that need to be added through fertilisers?
It's not just about the types of food that they eat and have access to, although that's certainly a part of it. But it can be other things too. It can be health factors. Just for instance, deworming is a health issue, but it has an enormous impact on child nutrition because if a child's competing with worms for the nutrition, then they're going to be behind.
Yeah. So what actually is the effect of hunger on people?
Well, I think you could talk about it in two ways. Maybe the first would be that hunger is going to sap your energy. It's going to reduce your ability to work, to earn a living, to be productive. And there are studies that have shown even small changes in micronutrients like iron can have an impact of up to 25% on the amount of work that an adult is able to do. At the same time, there are long-term impacts on child development, children that are undernourished, and that's a lot of children. In places like India, that's about 40%, and the same in sub-Saharan Africa. Those children are going to have less progress at school than they would otherwise if they were well nourished, and that's going to play out over their lifetime into significantly less in terms of earnings and potential employment.
Well, Mark, thanks for joining us. After the break, we'll hear from Carrie Unser, who recently visited Zambia and experienced the effect of hunger firsthand. Be sure to join us. Welcome back. So we know the hunger problem hasn't gone away, but what does it actually look like? Here to share just one experience with hunger is Carrie Unser. Carrie, thank you for coming and sharing your story with us.
Thank you for having me.
So Carrie, tell us, where did you go? What did you see?
Well, I recently travelled to Zambia, which is in southern Africa, and I went to this little village called Mambwe. And there I was introduced to Alec, who was a farmer there, who had 8 children, and he also cared for 2 orphans and his wife Josephine. And they welcomed us in. They were just the most gracious, kind people I've ever met. And you'd never realise that behind this, family who was all loving and friendly, that there was such tragedy and heartbreak.
So tell us, what was their story?
Well, just a few years ago, Alec was actually feeling quite unwell. He was unable to eat. He could barely stomach a cup of water a day. And through the night, he would have terrible aches and pains, and he would be sweating. So he, on the advice of a doctor, he went and got tested for HIV. And tragically, he came back as positive. And he was heartbroken, and he rushed his wife, Josephine, to go and get also tested. And she came back as positive as well. And they were heartbroken. I mean, he'd been feeling unwell. He wasn't able to tend to his farm, which is critical for them. And it was quite confronting for him because he had previously lost 2 wives. And he told me about his guilt. He thought, had I killed my 2 previous wives unknowingly with this disease? And it really was affecting him, you could tell.
It's just a terrible situation, wasn't it? So how did that sort of, I guess with his illness, he wasn't able to till the ground or to sort of grow food?
Yes, and he was finding it quite difficult. He was using the slash and burn method of farming, which meant, he would harvest once a year and then he would prepare his fields for the next planting season. But in doing that, in effect, he was making it harder for himself. He was ruining, the natural fertilizers that were in the ground. And he would grow enough to feed his family, but nowhere near enough to be able to sell things at the markets or be able to earn an income. And he found that really difficult. And they were living on a day-by-day basis, really.
So tell me, what was the poverty like within his family? How did it affect his children, for example?
Well, his children, they weren't able to actually go to school. The older ones who were of school age, they were required to stay back and help in the fields. Combined with his sickness and the fact that he was working a lot to try and, prepare his fields for the next planting season, meant that there was no time or money for them to attend school. So it was a lack of education that was really, stifling their futures.
Mm-hmm. So what started to turn things around for them?
Well, he was actually introduced by his uncle to some new farming techniques, which were part of ADRA's agricultural program. And it meant that he was now using natural fertilizers. From when he would harvest, he would just let the natural fertilizers from, the offcuts just, degrade in the ground, which would actually improve his soil naturally and improve the water retention at the same time. And this meant that, obviously it's going to be a lot more fertile, and he's growing a lot more. His farm has actually expanded from 2 hectares to 6 hectares in this time. And he's been able to actually, grow enough for his family so they can survive, as well as have enough to sell at the markets, which he is finding really empowering because he's able to provide a stable income for his family.
So how are they able to bring up water? Because I understand in parts of Africa they experience drought.
Yes, he's quite fortunate. His property actually backs onto a small creek or river, and he's been gifted a treadle pump by ADRA as well, which means that he's much easily able to irrigate his crops. And it was really incredible to see one in action. He has a few farm workers that he can employ now because his farm is quite large, as you'd imagine, and that all, put together the treadle pump and, move it around to the various sections of the farm. And they really enjoyed showing us how much it was helping them and improving their farm.
Yeah. So did you have a go yourself?
I did. There's a certain technique and a certain art, I think. I kept putting blocks in the pipes. That wasn't very good.
Oh, at least you got your morning exercise.
I know, it was. It was like a stepper. It was very good.
Yeah. So how far can these treadle pumps pump water for?
Well, it's about a 50-metre long pipe. So what happens is they take it from the one water point which is closest to the field, and then they are able to move it just, where they can. But with these new improved farming techniques, it means that they water a little bit and it actually goes a long way. So it's much better and much more efficient for what they're doing.
Does he share the treadle pump with his neighbours as well? Or?
They've actually all got one. Every farm around has been gifted a treadle pump, and they're finding it incredible. They're able to grow just so much more with this improved use of water.
Wow. So I mean, water is really one of the things that's been restricting agriculture so much in that region in the past. So
definitely, and it's really encouraging to see. He has plans now, and I think that's one of the things that was really troubling him, was that his children weren't able to go to school. And with this money now, he has plans to buy a house in the village of Mumbai and rent it out. He's going to be able to construct it and pay for it and rent it out. And with that extra income, he's going to be able to send his children off, finish school and get a university education. And he was just so excited to tell us about that. And that's just all from improving these farming techniques and enabling him to provide for his family.
So is Tambwe the only one in his community to benefit from this?
No, and that's the wonderful thing, farms all around this area are just blossoming, and you can see it as soon as you drive in. There's maize, it's 12 feet tall lining the roads, it's beautiful. And we were able to meet with the district commissioner, and he spoke about how he appreciates so much what ADRA has brought to the community, because he said, I don't want ADRA to ever leave, because he's obviously seen the benefits of this. So the farms are increasing and improving, the markets are better stocked, and you can just see the income that it's generating. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to visit that project, and from my recollection, I think there was 7,000 people who were lifted out of poverty and starvation with that agriculture project in that region.
Yes, it's just amazing to see.
Yeah, and the amazing thing is that actually they didn't just then grow the crops and become wealthy themselves. They've actually reinvested in the healthcare of their whole community through the wealth that they've generated.
Mm-hmm. And the wonderful thing about this project is that once you've been trained in these new techniques, is that you're empowered to then go and teach other people, which is how it's it's spreading at grassroots level, and it's wonderful to see them imparting the knowledge that they've been given.
Great. Well, thanks very much for sharing with us, Carrie.
Thank you for having me.
As we've heard, without help growing and sustaining his farm, Alec and his family may not have survived. And Alec is not alone. After the break, we'll talk about how we can play a role in helping to alleviate hunger around the world. Welcome back. Before the break, we heard how a Zambian family was helped out of a pretty dire situation by agricultural training. I'm joined by Chris Jensen, the Director of International Programs for ADRA Australia. Welcome, Chris.
Yep, thanks, Jonathan. Good to be here.
So, Chris, why don't we just give hungry people food?
Well, look, yeah, that may be one solution. I think there are times when there's a need for that. People don't have any food. It's necessary, but also need to look at, well, what is the root cause of this problem? We need to give skills, we need to give training, we need to give education. The provision of water is very important as well. So what we need to do is step back and say, well, why are we in that situation and how can we help these people such that they can help themselves in the future?
Now give me a little bit of faith here, because there is a transition, isn't there, where you actually provide the food until they can grow it.
Well, absolutely. I think if you don't have any food, it's very hard to have the energy. You may not have the right type of food in terms of nutrient levels or your vitamins and your minerals, so you don't have the energy to work. So I think you need to be realistic and say, if you're working with people who are on the edge of starvation or extreme malnutrition, it's illogical to assume that they can just get out and work the field. So, we need to help people to get to the stage where they can help themselves.
And I guess it's not all just about education of coming in and telling them what they should be doing, is it?
No, absolutely. I think a lot of it is listening. A lot of these people have worked in their fields or with their livestock for quite a long time. They understand how it works. What they need is a bit of a help, perhaps some new techniques, some new ways in which they could operate. In my personal experience, I was in Mongolia working in the Gobi Desert, not an area we think of in terms of vegetable production, but with the right techniques. We've worked with communities who were able to start to grow their own vegetables. Now that's something probably that they never thought they could have before. But with the right techniques, the right skills, and the right tools, these people are able to help themselves.
So I guess that Mongolia is an example of that difference between hunger and malnutrition.
Yeah, that's a great point. In Mongolia, we have the challenge where a lot of people, depending on their livestock, on dairy products and on their meat, to supply their dietary requirements. But that's an absence of vegetables. And so you can see that if people just have one type of food, that then they wouldn't get all the vitamins and minerals that they require to have a healthy diet.
Yeah. So, sometimes we think that it's just a lack of water, but actually in Mongolia, the situation was quite different in terms of the seasonal issues that they were faced with.
Absolutely. And that's something where ADRA's been working to look at things like greenhouses, where we can, with a very simple technology, we can extend the season of growing from 3 months to 4, maybe even 5 months. So yeah, the seasons do have play a strong part in the way in which you can grow vegetables, the way in which you can do agriculture.
Yeah. So what other methods do we use to try and help people with their agricultural challenges?
I think one of the biggest things that I mentioned before is education. I think sometimes that there's new techniques that people can use. I think if people look at the same way in which they perhaps do their slash and burn or more basic agriculture techniques, that they can be actually disrupting the way in which the basic nutrients can get into the soil. So there's techniques that we can help people so that they can improve the way in which they can get yields.
We heard a little bit in Carrie's story about treadle pumps.
Oh, yeah.
So tell us a little bit about treadle pumps.
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems with, of course, growing vegetables is having water, something perhaps we don't think about, but farmers everywhere depend a lot on the weather to grow their crops. A simple technology like treadle pumps is where you can have a simple step technology that then in turn pulls the water up. It's very simple, it's not likely to break down in a hurry, and it can access the water table and bring the water into the crops so that we can have access to water all year round, so that crops aren't dependent entirely on the rain, that you can also have water where you want and grow crops, as they wish.
So how much would a treadle pump cost?
Oh, you're looking at a very limited amount of money. Probably only about $500 will get you, quite a number of treadle pumps.
So $500 could lift, anywhere from say 3 to perhaps even 10 families permanently out of starvation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's that easy sometimes.
Wow. And is there other equipment that sometimes people are lacking that needs to be supplied?
Sometimes it's simple tools. Sometimes as simple as a fence, because there are often livestock, which is a big part of agriculture in some developing countries. So a simple fence can stop cows and the sheep and other animals and the goats getting into your vegetables. There's also, as I mentioned, hand tools that are really beyond the availability of some people because they're extremely poor. They're really challenged by, more simple things.
So is putting a fence around your garden what we call food security?
Yeah. No, I mean, food security is quite a complex thing. It's about making sure that food's available, that people can buy food, that there's quality food available that meets all their requirements, and that it's there for a longer period of time and available as they need it.
So it's about sustainability.
Yeah, look, it's about saying, well, you can't just, this is why before we talked about why can't you just hand out food. It's about saying that the food is there available as people require, such that it meets all their dietary requirements, in a sustainable long-term manner.
So I guess that food security is more than just having a full stomach.
Yeah, absolutely. What I've seen in the communities where we work is you can see the increased income these communities have. They have increased health, less people getting sick, have more energy to work harder. And one of the biggest benefits is for the children. They then have education, they don't have to work in the fields every day, and they have an opportunity for a future.
Well, Chris, thanks for joining us today. It's hard to believe in a country as affluent as ours that people are still going hungry. But sadly, around the world today, millions are. And for many of them, it's a life or death issue. As we've heard today, however, there is hope. There is a way that you can help. And if you'd like to go to ADRA's website and look today of ways that you can help to alleviate hunger around the world, then you would be contributing to the Compassion Challenge.